My name is Sean Parker. Co-founded, I'm an entrepreneur, and I co-founded 3 companies, Napster, Plaxo, and Facebook. So, founded Napster with my partner, Sean Fanning, and we were both high school students when we came up with the idea. We were both 18. We'd never founded a company before. But we were both really interested in technology. We were programmers. Sean and I actually met over the internet, which is an interesting story in itself because we'd never even met in person when we founded the company. We were both hackers, and so we met because of this shared interest in computer security, which is the euphemistic way of saying hacker. The two of us were both actively trading MP3s. And at the time, there was no easy way to share MP3s. It was something that, you had to be a pretty sophisticated computer user to figure out how to get an MP3 player, how to get your music collection converted into MP3. It wasn't a mainstream thing yet. So the vision behind Napster in the very early stages was just to come up with a system that made the sharing of MP3s so easy that a housewife or a grandmother in Iowa could do it. In the very early stages, we were just happy to launch a piece of software and happy to start a company. But we very quickly realized that this had the potential to be revolutionary. We didn't know how controversial it would be. We actually, in the early days, believed that we'd be able to strike deals with the record labels to legitimize the product and build a legitimate music distribution service. There was a bet that Sean and I had made early on, and there were basically 2 ways that Napster could go. One way was that the labels did a deal with us. We transitioned the entire user base to a legitimate music distribution service and turned this piracy free-for-all into a service where users were actually paying for content, and that the record labels would lose an extraordinary amount of value, but then ultimately they would do this deal before too much value was destroyed. The alternative perspective was that the labels would completely disintegrate, or that the labels would essentially collapse. They would lose billions of dollars in value, and only at the point where all of this value had been destroyed would they come around to the idea of doing a deal with us. And then at that point, they would be reborn from the ashes, like the phoenix being reborn. And I actually didn't believe it would ever get that bad. What ended up happening was actually far worse. The record labels have essentially lost half their value, possibly more, in terms of market cap. The global music industry has gone from a $45 billion industry to a $14 billion industry in the span of a decade. By the time they shut us down, we actually voluntarily shut down the service, which is an interesting fact that doesn't get reported. But by the time we shut down the service, most internet users had experienced Napster. We had resulted in the deployment of broadband. We were the single most important application in terms of broadband deployment across the US. And there were stories of users calling Comcast and saying, "I want Napster service." And they were confused about, for them it was just they wanted faster access to downloading of MP3s. So we were this incredible cultural phenomenon. We'd introduced the concept of peer-to-peer to the world. And where was I going with this? What was your original question? And it was the first and last time in the history of content distribution where the entire population of internet users had been aggregated on one product. So we represented a unique moment in history where if the process of transition had been managed correctly, we could have seamlessly transitioned that entire user base from a illegitimate piracy-based service to a legitimate content distribution service similar to iTunes, but without the bandwidth costs associated with something like iTunes, with social access and discovery of music, which would have led to an even greater volume of music getting discovered and consumed. And I think we ultimately could have grown the overall size of the market for recorded music. Instead, when the service was shut down, the users scattered to a variety of peer-to-peer networks which were decentralized. And this was actually one of the threats that, sort of the unspoken threat in our negotiations with record labels. We always believed that if the Napster service, which was centralized in the sense that there was a company behind it that was accountable, that maintained servers, and there was a central index of all files contained on our servers. So if you shut down our servers, you shut down the system. But this was not true of the decentralized services. With services like Kazaa and Gnutella and LimeWire, if you shut down, there was no company to sue. There were no servers to shut down because the service was completely decentralized. So part of our unspoken argument to the record labels was that if you shut us down, our user base will splinter into a million jagged little pieces and you'll never be able to clean up the mess. And unfortunately, that's what happened. They shut us down and our user base scattered across a variety of services that were all illegitimate, unaccountable services with no company to sue, with a decentralized product that could not be shut down. There were really two components to Napster, and the media tends to focus on one or the other, but I think they're both important. One of them was instantaneous access to all music at your fingertips. The celestial jukebox vision that digital music people talk about. The other piece of it was the sharing of music, the social component. And it was the access to all music at your fingertips that got people interested initially. But that didn't lead people to spend, our users spent hours a day using the software. It wasn't just search and access to music which led them to spend so much time. It was access to all of their friends and their music. So you'd start using Napster, you'd do some searches, you'd find someone who shared your interests because you could see all of their music, and you'd start rediscovering music that you had forgotten about and discovering new music that you'd never heard of, exploring other people's music collections. You'd connect with your friends on Napster, look at their music collections. And that vision ended up, we believed that the social piece of Napster was actually the most important part because music is such a social phenomenon. You know, kids tend to listen to the music their friends listen to. And we believed that we could increase the consumption of music dramatically by making those social features better and better. We never actually had a chance to do that because the service was shut down before we were able to implement the longer-term vision for what we thought Napster would become. I think that in the early days of Napster, Sean and I we hadn't developed the tools yet that we would have needed to get to a different outcome. We were learning everything as we went. It was our first company, so we were learning about corporate finance, we were learning about management, we were learning about intellectual property law. We learned more about intellectual property law than we ever bargained to know, than we ever wanted to know. It was just trial by fire. We were learning everything as we went. So we didn't come to the experience, it was our first time doing all of these things. So we didn't come to the experience knowing the things we needed to know in order to control the outcome. We essentially launched the product. The product changed very little over the course of 2 years. And we spent most of that time just reacting to external events. So we couldn't be proactive about controlling the outcome. We were only able to react to the things that were happening to us. I think that had we started the company today, Sean's gone on to found other companies and other successful companies. I've gone on to found 3 companies and a venture fund. I have a much clearer understanding of the mistakes that we made. So if we were to found the company today, I think that we could get to a very different outcome. Even just understanding how to negotiate with the record labels, we barely understood what a record label was when we created the product. We understood vaguely what they did, but we didn't understand all the different pieces within the record label, production and A&R, and we didn't understand sort of the overall ecosystem of the music industry. We didn't understand what a publisher was versus a record label. We understood copyright generally, but we didn't understand the particulars of copyright law. So I think we weren't in a position to control the outcome. And I think on the flip side, the record companies themselves weren't ready. We were the wake-up call for the record companies. We were the first time that they were forced to recognize what was happening with content distribution on the internet. In fact, there was a conference that I went to in the very early days of Napster in Washington, D.C., and the theme of the conference was an end to piracy. They actually believed, and I think they had someone from the RIAA and someone from one of the record labels and a couple artists on a panel, and they actually were congratulating themselves on the year-over-year decline in piracy that had occurred. And I think I stood up and I asked some question. I was totally anonymous at that point. Nobody had ever heard of me. But I asked a question about, well, what if someone created a peer-to-peer, a piece of software that connected users to one another so that they could share their music collections? And I think that they were completely dumbfounded by this question, and it's something that they'd sort of never considered. So they gave some kind of pat answer and then went back to congratulating themselves on how piracy had declined. So they were completely asleep at the wheel. I mean, there was no awareness of what was coming, and Napster was the forcing event that woke everybody up and made them realize, forced them to realize, the way distribution was changing. For the first time in the history of the content industries, the cost of production, the cost of distribution, and the cost of marketing has gone down so dramatically that anybody with a little bit of studio equipment, a microphone and a keyboard in their bedroom, and Pro Tools on their laptop can make music which has the same production quality as professional music. So you have this democratization of production, which has enabled an enormous bounty of new music to be created. And that music can actually find distribution for free on the internet. Bands can build a following. They're able to build a following. They're able to sell tickets and run a profitable touring business and merchandising business. And they're able to market their content basically for free using social media. So the barriers to entry have been lowered dramatically. So now anybody who has a passion for music can participate. However, I think that a lot of the great music that's getting made isn't being heard by a majority of the population. So I think there's something lost there culturally. Because distribution has become so fragmented, it's become very difficult for the great music of our time to rise to the top. And it used to be in the heyday of the content industry when distribution was tightly controlled and radio controlled access to marketing, or MTV later, that the record companies could identify a talented band, and they could put an enormous amount of promotional and marketing muscle behind it and ensure that everybody heard that content. And that created a common cultural narrative that everybody was a part of. So everyone heard Bob Dylan, everyone heard Led Zeppelin. These bands are a part of a common cultural heritage that we all share. There's nothing quite equivalent to that today. And I think that there is a sense of loss that's present in that transformation, but like I said, it's not entirely a bad thing, because even though we've lost the sense of, that common cultural heritage, but we've also lost the cultural hegemony of a single music industry that controls what you listen to and when you listen to it. Well, I think social media is the final piece of the puzzle, because the challenge that we all face now as content consumers is deciding what content to consume. Because there's an incredible glut of information available to us. We have millions of videos on YouTube. There are millions of songs available on music distribution services like iTunes. So deciding what's relevant in this world of unlimited information is actually one of the hardest challenges, and that's the problem that's solved by social media, because your friends provide a filter. You log into Facebook and you see what your friends are paying attention to. You see the videos they think are interesting. Music hasn't yet been integrated with that experience, but that's something that's coming. So you'll be able to log into Facebook, you'll be able to see your friends' music collections, see what's relevant to them, see what they're listening to, see what the trends are, and that will become your window into the world of music. So the ultimate answer to the problem of distribution in a world of unfettered, unlimited access to all media is that your friends provide the filter. This is the first time in history where every consumer of content performs the three major roles that that the content industry traditionally performed: creating the content or producing it, editing it, or ultimately determining what's relevant, and then distributing it, so making it accessible to the world. So now on Facebook, you're essentially doing all three of those things. You can post a video, you can provide editorial commentary on your friend's video, you can like the video, in which case your friends are more likely to see it, and just by posting it, you're making it available to your friends. So the distribution is built in. You're basically doing all three things that the content industry traditionally did. I think we're going to look back on this point in time as a point of transition, where a lot of, we're still somewhat dependent upon the old model of distribution. So as an artist, you still can't ignore the CD. But for the first time, you have access to a new form of distribution, and you can build a fan base, build a following, and build a successful career without access to the traditional forms of distribution. But it's kind of an awkward transitional moment where it's not clear that you can completely abandon the old approach, but it's not clear that the new approach is completely adequate. So you sort of have to straddle both worlds. I think it's also, there's a lot of music today has the potential to be culturally ubiquitous, that has the potential to touch everyone, but only a small number of people are finding it. And that tells me that the distribution model is still broken. That while bands have better access to distribution than ever before, unsigned bands that don't have a record label relationship, there's still an inefficiency in the market, because a lot of the really great music isn't getting heard, isn't getting as broadly distributed as it could be.